Welcome back to Sip and Talk. We've got quite a topic brewed up for you today. It's one that's really been bubbling up globally.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about those U.S.-China trade tensions, but, we're not just scratching the surface with headlines.
Right, we're going deeper. We found this really fascinating debate that gets right to the heart of it all.
Exactly. Think of it less like some dry economics class.
Definitely not. More like a heavyweight boxing match, but with ideas. We've got Niall Ferguson, the historian,
Right.
and he's squaring off against Justin Yifu Lin, who used to be the chief economist at the World Bank. So serious heavy hitters.
For sure. And in the Sip and Talk session, we'll unpack what really went down in their G2 trade war discussion. G2, that's basically U.S. and China, the big two.
Yep, the big players.
We'll look at why some of China's points in this debate, well, they felt a bit thin maybe to certain critics.
A little unconvincing, yeah.
And we'll also try to unravel why some people in China often feel like the world, especially the West, is constantly out to get them, always smearing them.
It's a complex feeling, and there are reasons behind it.
Get ready for some aha moments, hopefully, because this isn't just about tariffs. It's about really different ways of seeing the world.
Totally. And what that means for all of us.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit for this whole showdown. We need to remember the context, right? The trade war itself.
Crucial, yeah. For a couple of years there, the Trump administration was really turning up the pressure on China, pushing hard for big changes.
Big changes to their trade policies, yeah.
Right.
Things like industrial subsidies.
Right, subsidies, protecting intellectual property, IP, and what they called forced technology transfer. Those are the big ones.
And the U.S. response, well, it wasn't exactly quiet.
Not subtle, no.
It was just round after round of tariffs getting slapped on Chinese goods. I mean, the numbers were huge. Reports back then suggested, by December of that year, something like $540 billion worth of Chinese exports were facing U.S. tariffs.
Yeah, an estimated $540 billion. That's, just to put it in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of some countries.
Wow. Yeah, it was a really big deal, a major economic confrontation.
And China, of course, had its own story, its own counter-narrative through all this.
Naturally.
They consistently denied they were doing anything unfair. They often called the Trump administration protectionist.
Right, turning the accusation back.
And they vowed to fight back. It created this really tense global atmosphere. You could feel it.
Okay, so into this tense atmosphere steps our first player, Neil Ferguson.
Right.
And he comes out swinging, basically challenging that popular idea that, Trump was just this wrecking ball.
And Xi Jinping was the sort of good guy trying to keep things stable.
Exactly. Ferguson questioned that whole narrative right from the start, shook things up.
He absolutely did. Now, he acknowledges China's incredible economic rise. You have to.
Of course.
He pointed out, China's GDP was tiny compared to the U.S. back in '96, like 10%. But by 2014, it had actually overtaken the U.S. based on purchasing power parity.
That's incredible growth.
And, credit where it's due, that growth pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. A huge achievement, undeniably.
But then came the ticker.
But then, he hits them with the question, how was this done? And his answer was pretty blunt.
Which was?
A mix of fair and foul means. That's how he put it.
Okay, foul means. Strong words. Now, on the other side, we've got Justin Yifu Lin.
Right. Lin's opening was all about trade being a win-win for everyone, a classic economic argument.
How did he explain the big U.S. trade deficit with China then?
He used the idea of comparative advantage. Basically, he said, look, China, with its roughly $10,000 per capita GDP, it naturally focuses on labor-intensive stuff, lower-value goods.
Makes sense.
While the U.S., way up at $62,000 per capita GDP, focuses on the high-value products.
So it's like we make the complex tech, they make the everyday stuff, that kind of division.
Sort of, yeah. He argued the deficit the U.S. has with China. It just shifted. It used to be with other East Asian places, now it's with China. So China isn't the root cause of U.S. trade problems, according to him.
Interesting. So where did he point the finger?
He pointed it right back at the U.S., at internal structural issues.
Like what?
He basically said the U.S. consumes a lot and saves little. And that kind of imbalance, he argued, naturally leads to trade deficits. And he even highlighted that the U.S. trade deficit actually went up after Trump put the tariffs on.
Really?
Yeah, suggesting, the tariffs weren't fixing the fundamental issue he identified.
Okay, so Ferguson doesn't just leave it at fair and foul. He actually digs into the foul part, right? He gets specific about the methods.
Oh, he absolutely does. He doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
He lays out this list of what he called foul plays.
All right, let's hear them.
Okay, first big one. Intellectual property theft. Espionage. He claimed it happens on a massive scale. Talked about sustained cyber warfare against Western companies. He even mentioned the FBI arresting Chinese employees from Apple for espionage.
Specific example.
Yeah, and he framed it not just as like a few bad actors, but a sustained government-sponsored effort. That's a really serious charge.
A huge accusation. Did he back that up with like specific reports or data in the debate itself?
He mostly spoke about the scale, referencing intelligence community concerns, and the sheer volume of incidents. He then moved on to other points like China bending, if not outright breaking WTO rules.
Oh, so?
Things like currency manipulation, deliberately keeping the yuan undervalued for a long time to boost exports, and systematically shutting out Western companies.
Shutting them out how?
High tariffs, for one. He cited China's average tariff at 8% versus the U.S.'s 3.1%. And also lots of non-tariff barriers, regulations, licensing hurdles, things that make it really hard for foreign firms to compete fairly.
Got it. And then there was that environmental point, which seemed kind of surprising in a trade debate.
Yeah, that was striking. He brought it out that since 2007, China accounted for, get this, 57% of the increase in global CO2 emissions.
57%?
While the U.S., during that same time, actually cut its emissions by 12%. And China's total CO2 emissions are now like 1.8 times those of the U.S. It adds another dimension to the impact argument.
Definitely. And he connects all this back to the average American.
He does. He notes that the median U.S. household's real income hasn't really budged much since 1999. He suggests there's a link between that stagnation and these trade imbalances, these practices he calls unfair.
So for Ferguson, the U.S. reaction, the tariffs, wasn't an overreaction at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He basically said the only surprise was that it took so long for the backlash to happen. He saw the tariffs as a much-needed reset.
A reset. And he even went further, right? Calling it Cold War 2.0.
Yeah, he dropped that bombshell.
Yeah.
But he specified it's not like the old Cold War with proxy wars and nuclear threats looming.
What kind of Cold War then?
A technology race.
Mm-hmm.
A competition for technological dominance. That's his framing. Pretty stark.
Definitely unsettling. Okay, so Lin has to respond to all this, right? These are heavy accusations.
He does. And this is where, according to many people watching the debate, his arguments started to seem maybe a little, well, less robust.
Yeah, like you said, trying to swat away a whole swarm of issues with just one newspaper. So take IPR, intellectual property. How did he defend China?
Well, his defense was that China actually has a very sophisticated intellectual property right regime. Very sophisticated.
Okay.
And he brought out a statistic. He said 84% of foreign companies that sued Chinese companies for IP violations actually won their cases.
84%. That sounds pretty good on the surface.
Right. And he contrasted that with less than 50% win rate in the U.S., supposedly.
But critics weren't buying that statistic. Why not? What was the catch?
Well, the main critique is that the statistic might be misleading. The argument goes many foreign companies don't even bother suing in China because they perceive the legal system as lacking transparency or worry about local protectionism, favoritism towards Chinese companies. So, that 84% win rate. It might only reflect the cases companies thought they had a really strong chance of winning, not the full picture.
So it doesn't account for all the companies that just gave up before even trying.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of joint ventures. Foreign companies often have to partner with a local Chinese company to get market access.
Right.
And that often involves sharing technology. Lin kind of brushed this off as voluntary.
Voluntary.
Yeah, like they choose to enter the market. But critics say, is it really voluntary if it's basically a requirement to do business there? It feels less like a free choice, more like a condition.
Feels pretty forced if that's the only way in.
Well,
Okay, what about that forced technology transfer point more broadly?
Lin insisted again, it's all voluntary. Foreign companies choose to invest in China, he said. They bring their best tech because they want to compete in that huge Chinese market. He used GM in China as an example.
General Motors, right?
But again, the counter-argument is that this sidesteps the structural pressure. Yes, they choose to enter the market. But the terms of entry often include tech transfer, implicitly or explicitly. So it's voluntary with a huge asterisk.
A strategic necessity, maybe, not a free choice.
Okay, WTO rules. How did he handle that?
Lin portrayed China as a model student, a student of A, regarding WTO rules.
The student of A.
Yep. He said China had been sued about 40 times, won most cases, and always followed the rulings when they lost.
Okay. And he contrasted that with the U.S.
He did. He claimed the U.S. was sued more than 80 times and, in his words, never followed the ruling.
Whoa, never followed. That sounds like a strong claim, too. Why did Lin's defense here seem weak to observers?
Because, again, it focused on the strict, literal interpretation of the rules, formal compliance.
While ignoring what critics call the gray areas. Things like massive state subsidies to state-owned companies, policies that subtly restrict market access for foreigners, regulations that aren't transparent. These things might not explicitly break a specific WTO rule, but they definitely undermine the spirit of fair competition.
Right, playing by the letter of the law, but maybe not the spirit. What about currency manipulation? That's always a big one.
Yeah, Ferguson accused China of it. Lin's counter was direct. He cited the IMF, said the IMF officially announced China does not manipulate currency. Case closed, basically.
But that felt incomplete, too.
To critics, yes, because it ignores the history. There's a pretty broad international consensus that China did systematically keep its currency, the RMB, undervalued back in the mid-2000s to gain an export advantage.
Right. I remember that being a huge issue back then.
Exactly. So even if IMF's policy statements are different now, denying the past actions makes the present denial seem less credible. It creates a bit of a trust issue.
Okay, last one from that list. Innovation and the latecomer advantage. How did Lin explain China's rapid tech progress?
He used this concept, the advantage of backwardness. Basically, countries starting behind can catch up faster by borrowing, licensing, or importing technology that already exists elsewhere.
Like learning from others?
Yeah. He compared it to how Britain caught up to the Netherlands centuries ago, or how the U.S. caught up to Europe. He argued it's not stealing if patents have expired, and he predicted China will naturally start innovating more on its own as it gets richer, pointing to Huawei and 5G as an example.
Okay, that sounds logical on the surface. Why did that explanation seem pale?
Because it downplays or maybe ignores the huge role of the Chinese state.
Right.
We're talking massive subsidies, government-directed industrial policies like Made in China 2025, and deliberate policies to limit foreign competition in key sectors.
Right.
That's very different from the more market-driven catch-up that happened in the historical examples he used, like Britain or the U.S. It's not really an apples-to-apples comparison when the government is tilting the playing field so heavily.
Gotcha. It's like comparing a sprinter who trained normally versus one who got rocket boots from the government.
Yeah, something like that. It just changes the dynamic fundamentally.
So, stepping back from the specific point-by-point rebuttals, looking at the bigger picture of this debate, you start to see some, major contradictions in China's overall story, right?
Absolutely. Analyzing the whole exchange really brings these tensions to the surface. It feels like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes.
Okay, like what? What's the first big one?
Well, there's this obvious tension between championing free trade on the global stage while practicing pretty significant protectionism back home.
Right. Lin is arguing trade should be win-win, criticizing U.S. tariffs.
Exactly. But then there's less acknowledgement of China's own high tariff barriers, those non-tariff barriers we talked about, policies that often discriminate against foreign companies. Yeah. It can come across as, a double standard.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the whole puzzle of the state's role versus market competition. Lin tries to frame China's success as mostly market-driven, using that latecomer advantage idea.
Yeah.
But how do you square that with the incredibly fast rise of companies like Huawei or the dominance of giant state-owned enterprises? It's hard to explain that without acknowledging the massive government subsidies, the state planning, the protectionist policies. It doesn't really fit the free market logic he's presenting.
Yeah, the state's hand seems pretty visible.
Very. And then there's this idea of our internal issues are our own business.
How does that play out?
Lin acknowledges China has internal development challenges, but he tries to disconnect them from the international criticisms. Yet many of China's economic actions, subsidizing exports heavily, restricting foreign companies, those clearly have external effects. They ripple through global markets.
Right. You can't just build an economic wall around yourself and pretend it doesn't affect the neighbors.
Exactly. It has global consequences.
Yeah.
And finally, there's this contradiction between claiming ideological neutrality and, well, potentially exporting a model.
Explain that one.
Lin emphasizes that China never forces its political system on others, unlike, he argues, Western democracies. But then you look at big initiatives like the Belt and Road.
Right, the infrastructure projects.
They often come with these opaque loan deals, leading to debt issues for some countries, and they undeniably increase China's political influence in those regions. So it starts to look a bit less like pure non-interference and more like, well, projecting power and influence, which might implicitly promote their model.
So the debate really shifted, didn't it? From tariffs and trade numbers to these much bigger questions about systems, values, trust.
Absolutely. It moved way beyond economics.
Yeah.
And Ferguson, he didn't shy away from making that shift explicit. He leaned right into it.
What was his core argument there?
He basically argued that Trump's real goal, or perhaps the underlying U.S. goal, wasn't just about fixing the trade deficit. It was about challenging China before it's too late.
Before it's too late for what?
Before China potentially replaces the U.S. as the world's dominant power.
Wow. And he painted a pretty grim picture of that possibility.
He did. He said something like, we'd miss the United States for all its flaws if China became number one. He pointed to what he sees as a fundamental lack of meaningful rule of law in China.
Meaning?
Where individual rights, minority rights, they're all secondary to the Communist Party's power. He brought up the treatment of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, the actions in the South China Sea as examples of this system in practice.
He also criticized the Belt and Road Initiative on these grounds.
Yeah, he argued it doesn't really promote rule of law in the countries it operates in, like in Africa. And he suggested Xi Jinping's strong nationalism isn't just about confidence, but maybe fueled by China's own internal challenges, like slowing growth, leading them to be more assertive externally.
Okay. How did Lin respond to that direct ideological challenge? That's getting pretty fundamental.
He pushed back hard, obviously. He used that quote reportedly from Malaysia's former Prime Minister, Mahathir.
What about?
The one saying Malaysia had contact with China for 2,000 years and stayed friends. But after just 2 years of contact with Western powers, they ended up colonized.
Ooh, that's a sharp historical point to make.
Definitely lands a blow. Lin basically implied Ferguson's warnings were just products of his own cultural heritage, looking at China through Western eyes.
And he defended China's system.
He insisted China's system, yeah, it's somewhat different, but it has the same purpose, to improve the well-being of the people. And he repeated that China never tries to ask other country to adopt our system.
Unlike the West, he implied.
Unlike Western countries, which, he argued, have caused economic collapse and chaos elsewhere by trying to force their political systems on others.
It really becomes a clash of narratives about history and global impact.
Totally. And the moderator even jumped in with a really key question for the audience, touching on trust. Can the world, especially neighbors like South Korea, really trust China, given policies like Made in China 2025?
That's the core issue, isn't it? Trust.
And she threw in a fascinating curveball, a survey from the U.S.-China Business Council, showing that the number of U.S. companies that saw Made in China 2025 as a positive opportunity had actually almost doubled.
Wow, that complicates things. Opportunity versus threat.
But Ferguson wasn't swayed. He flatly called the idea that China will just naturally liberalize politically as it gets richer a complete fantasy.
Why so certain?
He pointed to what he described as a growing chill on Chinese university campuses, saying the regime was becoming more ideological, not less. He framed it as a fundamental choice, a democratic system with rule of law versus a one-party state where rights are secondary.
And he brought up North Korea.
Yeah, he asked pointedly why China continues to support the most totalitarian regime on the planet. For Ferguson, it boiled down to the future, the viability of democracy in East Asia. High stakes.
Okay, this is heavy stuff. Let's shift slightly. Given all this criticism and pushback in the debate, why do so many people in China feel like the West is just out to smear them? Where does that feeling come from?
That's a really important question, and the debate gives us clues. It's not just paranoia, there's a real context.
Like what?
Well, first, there's the historical narrative. Official Chinese propaganda constantly emphasizes the century of humiliation.
Right, the period of foreign intervention and exploitation.
Exactly. So this narrative frames China as a historical victim of imperialism, primarily Western. It makes it easier for many Chinese today to see current Western criticism not as valid concern, but just as a continuation of that past hostility and attempt to contain China's rise, to keep it down.
You can kind of hear echoes of that in Lin's arguments about Western motives, right?
Definitely. subtle implications about containment. Then there's the information environment inside China.
Tightly controlled.
Very. So negative international reports may be about the Belt and Road's debt traps or human rights issues. They often get filtered out, downplayed, or actively reframed as Western bias or deliberate misinformation.
So people just aren't hearing the criticisms in the same way.
Or they're hearing them alongside a constant narrative of China's achievements and Western decline. When that's your main diet of information, it's easy to think the world just doesn't understand us or they're being unfair.
Makes sense. What else contributes?
Nationalism is huge. The government actively promotes it, framing China's rise as this great national rejuvenation, a challenge to Western dominance.
So criticism feels like an attack on national pride.
Exactly. Arguments like Lin's that China doesn't interfere while the West causes chaos that resonate strongly with national pride. It makes people more inclined to believe criticism comes from jealousy or fear, not legitimate issues.
And let's be honest, sometimes Western reporting can be biased or oversimplified, right?
Absolutely. And when that happens, it unfortunately gives Chinese officials and people ammunition. They can point to flawed reporting and say, see, we told you they're biased.
Well,
Lin, using that specific IP win rate statistic, even if misleading, might have been aimed partly at countering this perceived bias, confirming the smear narrative for folks back home.
it becomes a cycle.
Yeah, a kind of self-reinforcing loop.
Yeah.
And finally, just the basic fact of geopolitical competition. As the U.S. and China compete more intensely, any criticism from the West, like security concerns about Huawei, for instance, gets easily framed by Chinese officials as part of a larger plot to hold China back.
Just another move in the great power game.
Pretty much. And that message gets pushed hard internally, deepening that feeling of being unfairly targeted.
Okay, so let's bring it back to where the debate started, sort of the economy. The audience wanted predictions, right? A forecast.
Yep, the crystal ball moment. Lin stayed pretty optimistic about China's economy, despite global headwinds.
What was his prediction?
He predicted China would keep growing around 6% annually, contributing something like 30% of all global growth. Huge numbers.
Why so confident?
He pointed to China's huge potential for domestic investment, high savings rates, and massive foreign currency reserves as buffers and growth drivers, betting on the internal strength.
And Ferguson. I'm guessing he was less rosy.
Much more skeptical. He predicted China's real growth rate would actually decline rapidly.
What?
Two main reasons. Demographics. The lingering impact of the one-child policy means a shrinking workforce and hitting limits on how much debt or leverage the economy could handle.
And he was optimistic about the U.S.
Yeah, he dismissed talk of a U.S. recession at the time and made this really bold statement: a free society will always outdo an authoritarian one.
Wow.
And he even gave investment advice based on that. He said, basically, be long the United States and short the People's Republic of China for the next 10 years.
Putting his prediction into market terms.
Exactly. And then came the most dramatic finale you could imagine for a debate like this. Lin turns directly to Ferguson and asks him straight up, do you really believe in what you said?
And Ferguson,
Without missing a beat, just says, I do. Just drops the hammer. We can have a bet.
a bet on what?
$2 million US, Lin says, that in 20 years, China will overtake us, meaning the U.S. economy in nominal terms.
$2 million? Wow. Did Ferguson take the bet?
He couldn't match that amount, apparently, but he countered. He offered to bet 200,000 Chinese renminbi. That's maybe like, what, 30,000 US? That China won't overtake the U.S.
Uh-huh. What a way to end it, putting actual money on the line based on their fundamental disagreement about the future.
Incredible, right? It just perfectly captured the intensity and the high stakes of their whole clash.
Wow, what a journey through that debate. Seriously, big ideas flying around.
Definitely. It started with trade, but it really became this profound clash of worldviews, of systems, of visions for the future.
It really shows you, doesn't it, how tangled up economics and politics and values really are?
You can't separate them.
Yeah.
It's never just about the dollars and cents or the tariffs. It's about fundamentally different philosophies driving global power shifts.
So after hearing all that breakdown, what do you think? It gives you a lot to mull over, yeah.
For sure.
Which is why it's just so important, to try and think critically, hear out these different perspectives, even when they clash so strongly.
Absolutely. We hope this conversation maybe sparked some new questions or thoughts for you listening. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive.
This Sip and Talk session.
Boy, this Sip and Talk session. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your shows.
Yeah, please do. And hey, do us a quick favor. Check out our good friend Micky's YouTube channel.
Yeah, Mickey's great.
He's got all sorts of stuff, hilarious memes, awesome music, sometimes cool wine tasting, travel vlogs. Seriously, just browse around. It's worth a look.
Definitely check him out.
Yeah.
And thanks for sipping and talking with us today.
We really appreciate you tuning in. See you next time.